Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the School of Self-Worth. I'm your host, Nicole Song. Today, I have a really special treat for you with our guest, Misasha Suzuki Graham. She is a graduate of Harvard College and Columbia Law School, and Misasha has been passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the legal profession, as well as in her own communities for over 20 years. She is the co author of Dear White Women, Let's Get Uncomfortable Talking About Racism, and the co host of the social justice podcast, Dear White Women. And we do get into how she decided to title her podcast that way and what the reaction is like. Misasha has a really remarkable story of her own about growing up Japanese and white, and she has really so many profound insights on what it's like to own your journey and really your story. So make sure to stay tuned. It's such a good conversation. And before we get going, if you are a high achieving Asian American corporate leader who wants the exact step by step to permanently reverse cultural conditioning so you can step into your power and fully thrive, DM me power at Nicole Song on Instagram and let's chat. I've got something there for you. Okay, friends, let's get into this remarkable conversation. Well, Misasha, thank you so much for being on the School of Self Worth. I'm so glad you're here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Misasha and I know each other through a mutual community in the Authentic Asian, and it's just like so fun for me to discover really powerful women doing such cool work in the world. Like I love, like the work you're doing with the book that you've put out and then your podcast, Dear White Women. And so I would really love it if you could give us like a little bit of an intro about yourself and then we can jump in from there.
Yeah. I never know where exactly to start, but I'll start like at the beginning. We
Hmm.
can go from there. So I'm the daughter of a Japanese immigrant father and a white mother. So based on that alone, race and identity has been like a central part of my life growing up. My parents were really great at making sure I was grounded in who I was and all of who I was, right? And so that involved, going to Little Tokyo. I grew up in Los Angeles, so going to Little Tokyo every Saturday after ballet, spending a lot of time in Japan with my relatives, as my dad was the only member of his family to come to the United States. But it also really gave me a sense of um, thinking about how identity influences who we are and how we move through the world. And I remember, starting to understand that being multi ethnic was very different than a lot of what, my friends experienced. There weren't many of us in school at the time, which I feel is very different now for my children's generation. And it also made me think about whose voices get heard in society and how. Which is largely the reason why I ended up after, sort of going to college, doing a little stint in Tokyo in finance and sort of checking things off like, wow, I really didn't like that. So I'm going to have to do something else. Was how I ended up in law school because I really wanted to make sure that everyone in our society has a voice and everyone in our society gets represented. Um, Even though I sort of went into a very traditional big firm law path of intellectual property litigation, I still did a lot of pro bono work on the side. And so when I left that big firm life after I had my two boys, a lot of the work that I've done since, including Nicole, like you mentioned, our Dear White Woman platform, our book, a lot of the speaking engagements that we do. When I say we, it's with my co host and best friend, Sarah. We do together or I do alone, is still based on that concept of making sure that everyone has a voice, making sure that when we think about who we consider to be American or who we consider to be worthy of their stories being told, that we make that as expansive as possible.
Such a powerful message just from the get go. And I have so many questions from parenting to like how you named your podcast and all those pieces. So, um, well, let's start with, just like you were talking about growing up multi ethnic. And how is it with your own kids? Like, what has that been like? Like the way that your parents did it, how has that affected your approach, because I feel like now these days there's so many kids multi-ethnic, right? Like, just I live in Seattle, you're in the Bay, like everywhere you go is multi-ethnic. And how do you kind of approach that or think about that for anybody listening who might be in a multiracial marriage or considering the same thing or have kids who are multi-ethnic as well?
Yeah, I think, that's something that I am continually working on. I
Yeah.
will say, because the thing about being multi ethnic is you have a different relationship with the world than probably either of your parents do, right? And so
Right.
then turning around and parenting multi ethnic kids, and my kids, for reference, are Black, Japanese, and white, that they show up in the world very differently than I do. So, what I try and do for them is what I feel like my parents did a great job in doing for me, is, making sure they're grounded in who they are. Because the minute they walk outside, everyone's going to try and put them into a little box, like, of how they believe they are. And that box is probably not going to be who they believe they are. So they really need to be strong in all parts of their identity. Like, my boys take Japanese lessons. So they are learning how to speak Japanese, because that was really important, for me. But they also are very
Mhm.
grounded in what it means to be Black, in America, like, through my husband, right? Because I don't have any personal experience in that. And they also, so they understand that there are many facets of who they are. And I think that having them feel as secure as they can be in their own identity is like the thing that I can do for them as a parent. And especially being a multi-ethnic parent myself, like, something that I know is going to be part of their journey, and something that will be a challenge for them. And hopefully they just continue to stand strong in their belief of who they are.
Well, it's so interesting because there's the piece of how you always view yourself. Like, I think of it this way too. It's like how I view myself, and there's how society views me. And
Mm-hmm.
they're
Mm-hmm.
off very much different, right? Like, what I'm sure that people, I don't know what your kids look like, but people probably don't see the Japanese part of them very strongly, right? And so they see them in a very different
Yes.
way. And yet that can be it sounds like an anchored part of their culture and who you are. And I think that, like, that's interesting. And I'm curious if, like, just even the way you think about this or the way you've been parenting really informed the kind of work you do around talking about voices and what people are sharing. Cause I've met other people who are like that too, where they're multi-ethnic and they might have, a more dominant visual, right, of a certain racial background, but also feel very connected to another side of their background and navigating that. I love what you say about being grounded within yourself, but what has that sort of taught you around it? Because I don't know if people perceived you as Asian or Japanese growing up, if they were just sort of like, oh, I can't tell, right? Because you really, like, I think half kids, like, they can come out lots of different ways visually,
Hmm.
right? And so,
Yeah.
what do you like? How do you think about that? Because I think it's just an interesting experience all the time for anybody who's a person of color.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it was very confusing. I'll start with myself and then I'll talk a little bit about my kids. It was very confusing to people when I was growing up, because my parents, like, not only am I multi ethnic, but my parents made up my name. So there are no
Mm,
other Misashas. And I think, the quick backstory to why my parents named me Misasha is they really liked Sasha. And then my dad wanted the beautiful character in Japanese, and to sort of combine them and create this name that they thought all Japanese would think is Japanese and all Americans would think it's American. And that was a total fail, because all, all Japanese thought it was some, like, weird American name that they had never heard of. And all Americans are like, yeah, she could be Eastern European. I'm going to go with Russian. And so
Oh, that's so funny.
it was constantly like having to, explain my name and, what
Mm,
it meant. And so, and so, you know, honest truth is that I hated my name for the first 18 years, because every time, you go into a school setting and someone would call roll, or someone would ask your name, and they'd always pause, when you got to, like, and my last name, at the time, is Suzuki. So it's pretty late in the alphabet, and I can feel the pause, and then, like, the kind of like, and that part I hated, but now I love it, because it's such a sort of a perfect representation of how I feel I am, and
mm,
that combination of a bunch of my identities and facets. And so for my kids who, um, are really perceived as Black, I think, or at least not white and definitely not Japanese, but they have Japanese first names and they are unique Japanese first names. So I
Mm.
think they too have been sort of thrown into a world of having their name called and people doing a double and triple take, like looking for this person who they visualize and are like, no, that is not this kid. But at the same time, they are even better than I was at their age, of speaking up and saying, that's who I am, you know, and if people ask about it, they're very able to tell the story of why their name is their name. So it is a really interesting thing though, how you perceive yourself versus how the world perceives you, and what that struggle or that challenge or that growth is through that, I think.
Well, I think for anybody, there's like so much tension and there's so many different versions of it, of like of what you're perceived as. And like for me being full Asian American, full Chinese American, just always being asked like, what are you? In terms of like, what
Mm-hmm.
type of Asian are you? Right. And then they're being, oh, you don't look Chinese. And I'm like, well, that's great, but I am, like that kind like those kinds of conversations would come up a lot especially when I was younger. And I feel like as an adult, a little bit less, but still sometimes people do make a lot of assumptions like that. So I always think it's really interesting when you grow up what you're experiencing as a kid and then what you experience as an adult and like how you've come to terms with it, or maybe you haven't come to terms with it, because I think that occurs for a lot of people as well. But I'm curious for you then, like in terms of your own self-worth journey, then how did sort of this two different identities play into you being able to take ownership of them? And like how did you come into a place where like you stopped hating your name at 18 and figured out how to be and say like this is who I am, the way your kids can do it now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I grew up identifying as sort of fully Japanese and white. Like I was very strong. I spent a lot of time with my Japanese family. I spent, I speak, read, and write Japanese. Like it was very, I felt core to who I was. And I often had people telling me, like, oh, you don't look Japanese, oh, are you, kind of like this questioning look. And I have a very distinct memory of going into an Asian American Association group in my freshman year of college, and giving a number of people giving me a look like, why are you here? And
Mm.
I think it was right around that time where I had spent a lot of time trying to fit into sort of what I perceived to be an Asian mold growing up. Like growing up in Los Angeles, I wanted straight hair and I wanted, certain things to be different physically about me. And then I think though that moment in college and a couple others really made me realize like, this is who I am. And I might not be accepted in certain ways, but I'm just going to have to be strong in the fact that I know who I am. And so I think that because I know how Japanese I am, I don't need other people to validate that for me. And so I think that was all sort of tied into that. I hope that kind of answered your question, but that was like really one of that growth path.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense in terms of like you have to take ownership of that side of yourself. And I think even someone who is fully Chinese American, like I had to do that too, because
Mm,
often like you're trying to assimilate, you want to be accepted. And I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. It's like it was pretty white, and so to be accepted, I had to kind of like push my culture aside, or I thought that's what I had to do as a kid, even though I was in Chinese school and like going back to Taiwan and doing all of these things. And then ultimately, I think there's a phase, like I went to China, studied Chinese, and like really tried to immerse myself more in my culture. And then finally fully accepted Chinese and American as identity. So it's like a little different from yours, but similar, of like just like that's all of who I am. But I would say even to this day as an adult, for me, it's often about like, how do I keep expressing that side of myself more?
mhm,
And because I feel like I own it, and yet do I own it? That's always a question of like, am I owning it and sharing it as completely as, like for me being, there's all kinds of things I do every day that are like very Chinese, but I don't even think about it
mhm,
as Chinese,
mhm.
and you probably have similar things too. And then being like, why don't I share that or be more direct with people around, well, that's just how I grew up. That's the food I like to eat. That's like, those are the customs in my house, that kind of stuff. And so
Mhm.
I think it's interesting for any person who has like an immigrant parents and that experience of like, how do you navigate both of those worlds,
Yeah, Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that is still that's something I think about a lot too, and something I think about for my boys as well.
Yeah, like, how do you do that? Well, I'm
Mhm.
curious then, so getting back then now to your podcast and that journey to having in books around Dear White Women, like, where did that creation come from?
Yeah, so I love the title Dear White Women because no one feels neutral about Dear White Women. Like everyone feels something when they hear that title,
For
right?
sure,
It could be
yeah.
good. It could be good.
Yeah.
It could be really bad. But no one's going to be like, okay, well, that's an interesting title. And it really came out of the fact that, as I mentioned, I have a white mother. I grew up even I grew up in Pasadena, um, so a lot of the circles that I grew up in, or even later, college, law, like a lot of that were filled with, in particular, white women. And
Mm,
so I mentioned I have a co-host best friend. She and I met in college. She's also Japanese and white, with her immigrant parent being her mother. So we also had very similar circumstances of sort of growing up in white circles or navigating through white circles. Even now, right? I live in a predominantly sort of white suburb on the peninsula in the Bay Area, and she lives in Denver in sort of predominantly white areas. And so a lot of what we did and were privy to were these white circles full of white women. And so in those circles, we learned sort of three things. Like the first thing is what's being said in those circles. The second thing is what's not being talked about. And the third thing is what's being said when these circles perceive that there's no women of color in this space. And that third
mm,
part is, particularly interesting and hard, but it's also the part that we realized we had sort of unique access to, right? Because um, we were accepted into those circles until we weren't. And I think that that was what really created our desire to say, what if we could change these circles, right? What if we could change the topics in these circles, especially informed by the fact that Sarah and I both became parents, and we thought about this much broader, right? It wasn't just about us, it was about our children, and what were those circles going to look like, and how were those circles going to affect them. And so, what if we could change the narrative in these circles and broaden it outside of sort of what has always been considered the dominant American, sort of white, cisgender, heterosexual, sort of, middle class narrative of the United States, and make that inclusive, right? And what would that change for future generations? And so that's why we sort of started the platform. And our tagline is, we help white women use their system or use their privilege to uproot systemic racism without centering themselves in the process. And so it has been quite a journey. It's been sort of almost 6 years of the podcast. The book came out in 2021. And we do a lot of speaking individually and together about it. But I will say, that question about our title is one that we always get asked, and one that I love talking about. So I'm so glad you asked that as well.
well, then what did you find? Because, like, I would say I'm not someone who's been privy to conversations where they perceive, like, there's not a person of color there, like, that's right. So could you talk a little bit more about those 3 pieces and what you aim to do, like, with the podcast and with the books to, like, help educate women? Because 'Cause I'm curious if, like, is it mostly white women who then come to your platform, or do you tend to get also a lot of women of color as well?
We actually get a whole range, I will say.
Mm,
Like, we get a whole range, which is great. Some of our, um, you know, earliest listeners were white men, actually, as well.
mm,
And so, which I always find to be really interesting. But I think, like, it has been sort of a huge journey in starting with sort of white women, expanding that out, because I think what we learned, back to that question about what did we learn, and what was being said, I think that there has been a perception of it, even in, the Bay Area is considered a fairly liberal area, and I will argue that sometimes it is and sometimes it's not.
mm,
And increasingly, there are bigger divides. And I will say that it tends to be, people feel like, um, racism or some of the isms are someone else's issue, right? And we can help,
Mhm.
right? As white women, right? We can help with that. But in the end, really, it's someone else's thing. So we'll help when it's convenient, and then we'll kind of turn it off when it's not. Or I've had people say to me, for example, a parent said to me, "I don't want to talk about racism with my child because I'm afraid that it's going to traumatize them." And in that moment, I'm kind of like, well, I think that that might be more about your feelings than your children's feelings, right? Because I'll tell you, I have to have that talk in our household, right? Because I have black sons, and so I need them to come home every day, and so we've had to have that talk starting very early on. But I think there's a perception that, especially when I tell people what I do in these circles, right? And they're like, "Oh, that's such great work. Thank you for doing that." I'm like, "No, it's all of us, right? It has to be all of us in working together to get change to happen, right?" And white women in particular have so much privilege, and I know this is like a hotly contested word, but just in the fact that your voices are heard in places where other voices might not be heard, and there's so much power in that, especially now, to affect change that when other voices can't be or won't be heard. So that's a lot of what we try to talk about in these circles, which typically is not talked about at all.
Mhm. And do you find, because like obviously, I don't know, your platform was started before 2020. And then that was a time where like a lot of these conversations came to light. And then the experience I have now is a lot of people like feel like we have the conversation. And it's made like, oh, like, do we need to really keep talking about it? And obviously we do, but at the same time, people aren't as proactively having that conversation. And then you and I are now also recording this at a time where like a lot of companies are scaling back their DEI initiatives, right? And so, like I was like in Seattle, at least like Costco is like standing out as the company that is keeping their diversity, equity, and inclusion, programs, and a lot of other people are not. And so I'm curious for you, it's like, do you find like the interest in this conversation like waxes and wanes, like you said, because sometimes people, and I do think this is the privilege, right, of a white woman is that you could have it when you want to, and when you don't want to, you just don't. And right now it's convenient, it seems like, culturally for people to not have that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And you're absolutely right. Like with the murder of George Floyd, I would say there was an extreme interest in our platform.
Mhm.
Everyone wanted to have conversations. And it made me really hopeful in certain ways because I felt like these were conversations that we were not having. And suddenly everyone was willing to have these conversations, or at least entertain the idea of having these conversations. And so I thought, okay, this is progress, right? And I have to keep coming back to the fact that progress is not linear, right? Like we will
Mhm.
take three
Yeah.
steps forward, we will take two steps back. And I feel like we're in this two-step back phase, right? When it comes to having these conversations, because I also think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of people um, who don't have to have these conversations regularly. And right now, it is easier to not do that because you don't know how the other person feels. And so you might be walking into what you perceive to be a minefield, or people are feeling like this is a negative business decision now, or there's a whole host of reasons. And being close to Silicon Valley and close to big tech, which is coming under a lot of fire for sort of capitulating to a lot of ideas that are anti DEI or in the premise alone, right? And so um, I'm hopeful that we will start to get those three steps forward again. And I think regardless of what you call it, the concept is still there, right? That's what I've been trying to talk about now. Even if you change the name away from DEI, if we are talking about inclusion and belonging, right? If we are talking about psychological safety, if we are talking about how to have difficult conversations, then we're kind of still talking about that already. Because someone told me that when we think about diversity, diversity exists regardless of whether or not we talk about it or not. It sort of exists in every place for the most part. But like how we frame it, how we frame the movements around it, how we can continue to talk about it in ways that may not seem so DEI ish, for lack of a better word, but is really based on the same principles, that's what I continue to focus on. That's what gives me hope, and that's what I still see interest in. Like, maybe it's not exactly how it looked like in July of 2020, or in 2022, when Dobbs came down and everyone was so upset, and wanted to take action. But maybe it's going to look different, and maybe we'll continue to push forward in 2025.
Yeah. And I do think about it, like you said, it is around us all the time. And like even tying it back to the conversation you were having about your kids being grounded in all the diverse complexity of who they are, that the more we are like that, and like I think sometimes about that with owning my Asian Americanness, like the more I own that, then it just becomes normal, you know, to have people not trying to, like me, not trying to assimilate and just be like, no, like this is who I am, this is how I exist in the world. That people just are like, oh yeah, like that's just the way things are, versus shying away from having hard discussions or where it might come up in other ways, you know?
Yeah, completely.
Yeah. So I just think it's interesting, like what you're saying. And it sounds like, too, there's always going to be people who continue to have those conversations, even when it doesn't seem like the broader culture is having those
Hmm.
conversations. Cause I feel like I have these
Exactly.
conversations all the time still. And I don't do anything formal, like, air quote formal. I don't do anything formal with DEI, but I have them all the time. Like if my husband's going through a training or just like with friends or with people or on my podcast, we have these conversations. And it's one of the reasons I love featuring women of color on here is because there's just a different kind of conversation that's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, well, I'm curious, and for you, like, there's all these different points in your life where I feel like your self worth is probably challenged around your identity. And then now also, the kinds of, Dear White Women is the title of all the work that you're doing. Like, how have you been able to maintain and hold like your own worth and value for the conversations you want to share and the authentic voice that you want to put into the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think partly I think about a lot of the times that challenges came up a lot of times professionally as well in a law firm where sort of the Asian female voice is always sort of a submissive one, or the perception was that we were the workers, but we were not the partners, in the world. And I'm also that type of person where if you tell me that I'm not able to do something, I'm kind of like, well, watch me because I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
And I feel like my kids got a little bit of that too. So that makes me happy. But I think like what keeps coming up for me in this, especially, my oldest is 12. So especially since I had my boys, is like it is bigger than me, right? Like my self-worth is one thing, but if I can continue to do what I'm doing, and make it better for them, then that is sort of everything tied up all together, right? Like they're actualizing like a better world is also my self-worth. And like and it doesn't, and I keep also think like it doesn't have to be big and grandiose at times. Like if I'm having a discussion with someone and that shifts their point of view a little bit, and that someone goes out and maybe has an interaction with my kid later and changes their actions based on that alone, like that is sufficient for me. And so I think it keeps coming back to me, that little actions may have much larger impact. And also it may not be an immediate thing. And so those are hard things for me to sometimes realize, because I'm used to like a lot of achievement or a lot of pressure to achieve and to have these big titles and big things, and to think smaller, but not less impactful, has been sort of a shift that's been important for me.
I could see that. I think sometimes, especially with like big things that are happening in the world, like right now, like, we're talking while the LA fires are occurring, it can feel like we have to do everything right now to try to make the shift. But it's actually all the small things, right? That
Mhm.
we do, tiny things that are going to make much bigger ripple and impact. I was at the bookstore yesterday and I've read Atomic Habits, but I just like picked it up and I was like thumbing through, and he really talks about the compound nature of habits, right? Like every little thing you do 1% at a time adds up over time and for individuals. But I think it also is true of conversations about race. It's true of, anything that we're doing in our lives, like every tiny little thing, or like the climate, any tiny thing makes that bigger impact. And it can be super easy to forget because you feel like you're a cog in this like giant wheel out of your control. And then you have to come back to
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, no, 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 no. Like, where can I make a difference in a conversation with my kid or a conversation with somebody else who might ultimately talk to my child, right?
Yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
true. And um, I've been thinking a lot about, especially because all my family is in still in sort of LA County and Ventura County, about what you can control versus what you can't. And I think
Mhm.
to continue, and I tell my kids this a lot, right? Like, think about what you can control, versus what is out of your control, right? And we really need to focus on what's in our control. And it's such a hard thing to do, especially as an adult, because sometimes there's so many things happening at the same time, and so it seems like you can't do anything, right? And so going back to what can I control, what are the little things I can do, especially community based or family based, like those might have the biggest impact in the end.
Right. Yeah, I definitely believe that too. Well, what a rich conversation. So lovely to have you really truly share all of these things. And just like, I love the way you share in such a direct and simple way, because I think it's important for all of that conversation to continue to be really accessible in that way. And are you ready for our fast action questions?
I'm ready.
Okay. So they're easy and fun. My first one is what's on your nightstand?
Oh, I have this very big lamp that we just got. We sort of finished a home remodel. So this lamp is like this beautiful thing that sits on my nightstand. I have this book by George Takei about the Japanese incarceration. It's sort of a graphic novel that my younger son and I are reading together. And then I have a little polar bear that my older son made at school because they had to just decide on their spirit animal. And his is a polar bear. And I'm not even sure why it's a polar bear, but that is also on my nightstand.
Oh, that's very sweet. I love that. So fun. Okay, what is the last thing you watched on television?
Oh, um, I watched this show called The Agency, which is a BBC show, sort of about the British consul in Barcelona and all of the cases that they handle. I'm a big like crime detective, murder mystery watcher. And in particular, if anything's done by the BBC, I'm like, give it all to me. I love it. So I realized that being the consulate, not shockingly, but being the consul in a country is just full of terrible stuff that comes at you on a regular basis. So,
Yes,
but
I'm
it's
sure.
great. I would recommend it.
That's awesome. That's good to know. I like crime stuff like that too. That sounds super fun. Okay, next one. When was the last time you tried something new and what was it?
Whew. That that's a good one. My kids are always pushing me to try new stuff. So like having kids is really good on that front. My older son has been playing futsal. And so he's like, you should try this out. So we tried a little bit. I was never a soccer player. I am an even
Mhm.
worse futsal player. And I have a healthy fear of balls whizzing at me at a gym. So, but I tried. It was not great. He's a much better futsal player than me. So,
It was like me, I hated dodgeball. I think, like, all my fears around, like, having the same thing with, like, sports is, like, it just goes back to, like, dodgeball and the gym when I was in, like, elementary school. I don't even know if
I
they
get
allow that
that.
anymore. Can kids even
I
play
don't
that?
think they
I don't
do.
think they
No, I
probably
don't
will,
think they
'cause,
do.
you could get slammed in the face by a ball, but I think but anyways, when you said that, I was like, "Oh, yeah, I have all those memories as well." Okay, last one. This one's super simple. What are the top 3 most used emojis on your phone?
Oh my gosh. So I've been told by my tween that this is no longer an acceptable emoji, but the laughing face emoji.
I've
I
heard
use
that too,
that a
but I
lot.
use it all the time.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like, look, I'm too. He clarified it by, I guess old people like millennials can use it, and I was like, well, thanks. That's great for you. I use the emoji that has like one sort of eye open, the tongue sticking out, and like just like sort of the I don't know what's happening emoji. I use that one
Mhm.
a lot, and I will say the woman shrugging emoji. That's my
Mm.
third.
I love
Yeah.
that one, that's so fun. But the question I have for the Gen Z then is what do they use instead of the laughing face emoji when they think it's
Well,
funny?
he said, I have heard that it's sort of the skeleton face, like you died
You're dead.
laughing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he maintains that no emojis are cool. And he's, I guess, technically Gen Alpha, so I don't know, maybe we're
Oh,
heading
they're
away.
already here.
Yeah, I know. I don't know if I totally trust him and his, seventh grade friends on emoji expertise, but that's what I hear from the trenches of seventh grade.
That's so funny. Well, I also hear that they don't like punctuation. Like, they don't like
Yeah.
periods and stuff, that, like, if you put a period on it, it's very dramatic, and so you should never put, like, periods on your sentences, and I was a journalist for 10 years. I was like, "I will definitely continue to put periods
Oh, I don't
at
know
the end
what
of
I would do if I
sentences."
couldn't do that. I know.
I
Well,
know.
apparently, any text message over a sentence is too long, according to the
Right,
seventh
I think
grade
that's the other part
experts
of it. It
as
has to be,
well.
like, short, lots of
Yes.
abbreviations, no period.
Yes. It's either a meme or it's 3 words long. So that's what I prefer.
Yes, okay, well, thank you for updating us on what Gen Alpha is doing right now, it's so funny. Well, Misasha, it was so great to have you on. I love what you do and the work that you're doing, and what's the best way for people to find out more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So, my Dear White Women platform is on the web at dearwhitewomen.com. So you can find pretty much everything we do there. Also, I think I'm the most active on LinkedIn. So you can find me just by Misasha is, I think, my handle there. So yeah,
Yeah,
please,
incredible.
please reach
Well,
out.
thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story so openly with us. And again, like I really just am really inspired by the work that you do. So make sure you go follow her and find out more. And thank you so much, Misasha, for being on the School of Self Worth.
Oh, Nicole, thank you so much for having me. I had so much fun.